The stench hid before the footsteps, before the whispers, before the death. Your nostrils flinch. You don't know if the pain is in your lungs or your memory. Because you were there. Versailles had never smelled this way before, not even during the filth of winter latrines or the rot of spoiled feasts. This was different. This was flesh, rotten, blackened, bloated flesh, sloughing from the bones of a king still breathing. By the time Louis XV took his final breath, the royal bedchamber had become a necrotic vault. The sores on his body had split. His skin was described as eating itself. The doctors left, the priests gagged, and what remained had to be burned. Not for hygiene, but for fear. You are not a tourist in time. You are a witness, and what you're about to remember may never leave you again. If what you're about to witness unsettles or awakens something in you, consider subscribing, not for vanity, but to help these buried truths rise again. If it brings value, leave a like. If it haunts you, leave silence. Versailles, 1774, the final days of Louis XV. You stood beneath the gilt ceilings of Versailles, the most extravagant palace on earth, and watched the most powerful man in France collapse not in glory, but in pus. Louis XV, grandson of the Sun King, ruled for nearly 60 years. At one time, his presence commanded armies, his word rewrote laws, but by May of 1774, no power remained in his fingers, only rot. The disease came suddenly, but not without precedent. France had suffered outbreaks of smallpox for centuries, and though inoculation was gaining traction in Britain and among some enlightened thinkers, the French court remained skeptical, especially the king himself. At age 64, Louis XV had survived wars, rebellions, and assassins, but smallpox, carried in the coughs of courtiers and the clothes of servants, had slipped past the velvet walls of Versailles and found its way into the sovereign's bloodstream. It began with a fever, then the rash, then the lesions, then the smell. On April 27, 1774, the king complained of headaches and chills. The physicians called it a cold, but within a day, pustules began to appear on his face. These weren't mild, these weren't discreet, they multiplied quickly, spreading down his neck, back, arms, and eventually his groin. As the infection worsened, the pustules coalesced into great blackened scabs, a classic sign of confluent smallpox. The king's flesh began to decay while he was still alive, an agony so unrelenting. The Jesuit fathers refused to enter his chamber without perfumed cloths pressed over their mouths. Eyewitness accounts say the sheets of his bed were soaked with a fluid the color of rust. The odor penetrated the marble halls. No one dared open the windows. Rumors spread among the staff that his body was cursed, ridden with a divine punishment for a king who had indulged too deeply in mistresses, luxury, and neglect of the poor. By May 1st, no noblewoman remained at his side. His last mistress, Madame du Barry, had already been banished. His daughters, the mesdames, attended from a distance, reportedly weeping behind their lace veils, but never touching him. The physicians attempted bleeding, purging, and cauterizing. They failed. The royal corpse was not yet dead, but it was already rotting. There were arguments over whether to continue with last rites, not because of faith, but because the priests themselves couldn't stay in the room long enough to finish prayers without vomiting. The court whispered of divine retribution. His advisors fought quietly outside the chamber doors. Who would rule France once the flesh finally stopped breathing? Would it be his grandson Louis Auguste, the quiet dauphin who knew little of ruling but would soon become Louis XVI? Or would the king recover and bring vengeance upon those who'd already begun dividing his crown? They didn't have to wait long. By May 10th, the king's breath slowed. His eyes had swollen shut from the infection. His tongue had turned black. The end came with no dignity. But what remained behind was worse. The stench of his final days had so permeated the bed, the tapestries, and even the wooden walls that the entire room had to be burned. Not cleaned, not sanitized, burned. The linens were doused in alcohol and set alight in the palace courtyard. The chamber was sealed for weeks. Witnesses said the odor lingered still, a ghost in the silk. The rot of power, why the court fled first. They left him, not all at once, not with fanfare, not with mourning, but one by one, like servants abandoning a ship filling with rot. You remember how it started. The Maréchal de Richelieu, who had stood beside Louis XV through wars and court scandals, slipped away under the pretense of illness. Then the physicians, those garbed in white, who had filled Versailles with jargon and optimism, stopped returning. Even the king's confessors visited less often. No one wanted to be near what he had become. It wasn't cowardice, it was preservation, because by the second week of May, Louis XV's body no longer resembled a man. The pustules on his face had ruptured, leaving open wounds that crusted into blackened scabs. His arms were streaked with pus. The bed sheets, changed twice daily, came away soaked and stinking. One of the nurses fainted. Another had to be forcibly kept from fleeing. The king's own valet, who had dressed and undressed Louis every morning for 2 decades, refused to approach the bed. In another time, such desertion would have meant execution. But there was no one left to enforce it, not even the king. Louis had become immobile. His eyes were fused shut. His lips cracked and bled when he tried to speak. When the servants did enter the room, they did so with gloves, masks of linen doused in camphor oil, and sleeves tied shut at the wrists. Even the doctors debated whether to declare him dead before his final breath, simply to avoid the risk of remaining near him any longer. Outside his chamber, Versailles had already begun preparing for a new reign. Louis XVI, still only a dauphin, was kept at a safe distance. Letters were sent to nobles in Paris warning of possible contagion. The palace began drafting plans for funeral protocols before the body had expired. No one dared say it aloud, but the fear was not just death, it was smallpox itself. The contagion, the breath, the sweat, this fear was not unfounded. By the mid-18th century, smallpox was known to be deadly, disfiguring, and above all, contagious. The medical faculty at Paris, unlike their counterparts in England or Bavaria, had refused widespread inoculation, believing it dangerous or impious. That decision now haunted the marble halls of Versailles like a ghost. The irony was sharp. Louis XV had once been called Louis the Well-Beloved, a monarch adored by the people during his early reign. But now they whispered, not of admiration, but of punishment. Pamphlets spread quietly across France, crude woodcut prints depicting the king as a swollen corpse, bloated with sin. Religious fanatics declared his disease to be God's vengeance for the ruin of the monarchy's soul. Critics pointed to his decades of mistresses, his neglect of famine, his failures in the 7 Years' War. Even Madame du Barry, the last of his famous lovers, had been exiled from court only weeks before the sickness struck. She wept upon hearing of his illness, but from a distance. Her letters hint at both sadness and relief. She knew, as everyone did, that remaining near him would mean dying with him. So she, too, left. Inside the palace, the few who remained burned incense constantly. Bundles of herbs were placed in braziers to counter the stench. But nothing worked. One diary entry from a palace chamberlain reads, "The king is more scent than man. I can no longer tell where the body ends and the sickness begins." The court physician, Joseph Marie François de Lassonne, noted the body had entered a phase of liquefaction, a terminal stage of smallpox where the skin and underlying tissue begin to break down. There was no hope of recovery, only decay, and yet, no one dared declare him dead before the moment arrived. Because under French law, Predicting or even acknowledging the imminent death of the king was a punishable offense, treason. So the court waited, silent, choking. When the final breath came on May 10, 1774, it was barely noticed. The priest at his bedside had fallen asleep, his cloth soaked in vinegar pressed to his nose. The nurses had withdrawn to the far wall, unwilling to stand near the bed for more than minutes at a time. The king's last gesture, if it could be called that, was a low gurgle. And then nothing. No tears, no thunder, no speeches, just the thick, sour smell of a monarch reduced to wounds and waste. And with that breath, something else died too. The myth of the untouchable king. Because what followed was not mourning, not ceremony, but evacuation. The body was left in place until sunset. No one wanted to move it. Even embalming was debated. How to preserve a corpse that had already begun to rot before death. The decision was made. Seal the chamber. Burn the linens. Open no windows. Let no one enter. The body would remain until it could be sealed in a lead-lined coffin, not for preservation, but to keep the smell from leaking into the palace walls. Guards were posted outside not to protect the king, but to warn others not to enter. And within that sealed tomb of a room, the walls began to soak it in, the final, fetid legacy of a monarch whose pleasures, sins, and power had finally rotted him from the inside out. The coffin that sealed the smell. You still remember the hammering. It echoed down the corridor like the tolling of some crude cathedral bell, not for prayer, but for containment. The carpenters, pale and shaking, had been summoned from the outskirts of Versailles. Not the royal coffin makers, those were artists. These were builders of barricades. They were told, make it strong, make it thick, make it fast. They were not told why. But by the time they stepped into the king's chamber, they understood. The room, now sealed for nearly a day, had become something else entirely. No longer royal, no longer sacred, but rank, warm, wet, a chamber transformed into a crypt. The body of Louis XV lay motionless, but not silent. The gases from his decaying organs had begun to expand. The body swelled. His abdomen bulged unnaturally. The pustules had collapsed, leaving patches of raw, black tissue. The lips parted slightly, not in peace, but from the pressure inside. There was fear now, not just of disease, but of explosion. The last king who had died of smallpox at Versailles, Louis I, had burst after death. The memory had not been forgotten. So the men worked quickly. The coffin was lined with lead, then sealed with pitch and wax. No glass window, no cloth wrap, no final kiss on the forehead. The face of the king was never seen again. And still, it wasn't enough. By the third day, the coffin began to leak. Eyewitnesses say a dark, viscous fluid began to pool at its base. At first, they thought it condensation, but the smell, sweet and sick and unmistakable, proved otherwise. This was corpse liquid. It soaked into the velvet floor, into the fibers of the royal carpet. There was no more denying it. The king was decomposing faster than the rituals could catch up. For the first time in living memory, Versailles skipped protocol. Instead of the traditional 3-day vigil, where nobles would pay respects, the chamber was cleared. Guards stood with their faces turned away. The priest assigned to offer prayers vomited twice and excused himself permanently. A young page, no more than 14, fainted in the hallway outside. Then came the worst moment. A dog, a royal spaniel that had wandered loose from the stables, slipped into the antechamber. Drawn, perhaps, by the warmth, or the scent, the guards noticed too late. The animal licked the floor beneath the coffin. What it tasted cannot be written without revulsion. But it was not wine, and it was not holy. That night, the order was given. Burn the linens. Strip the room. Cleanse it with flame. Flames were not kindled out of superstition, but from necessity. No amount of vinegar or lavender oil could erase what had saturated the wood. The hangings, the bedding, the mattress was removed and destroyed in the courtyard, burned alongside the curtains and the king's final set of clothing. Witnesses describe the fire as giving off a sickly blue smoke, rising above the gilded spires of Versailles like a signal of shame. The room was sealed for months. No one would sleep there again. Not Louis XVI, not Marie Antoinette. The wing itself was eventually converted for other uses, none ever as intimate as a king's bedchamber. When the funeral procession finally began, it was subdued, not for sorrow, but for sanitation. The coffin was loaded at night, shrouded in black cloth, carried not by nobles but by workers in waxed gloves. No hymns, no choirs, just the wheels of the cart as it creaked down the stone corridors. At Saint Denis, the traditional burial site of French kings, a space had been prepared, but the stoneworkers had miscalculated. The lead coffin was too large, its seams bulging slightly from pressure within. Rather than risk delay, they widened the tomb by hand. It was said the gravediggers didn't look up once, not even when the coffin gave a final shudder. One final breath, one last escape of trapped gas. A sound like a sigh, but hollow. Too late to be his. Too wet to be air. They buried it quickly, covered it in stone, walked away. Later, a young clerk was ordered to enter the now abandoned chamber at Versailles and catalogue the remaining royal possessions. He wrote only 2 words in his logbook for the king's deathbed. Everything contaminated. No relics were saved. No shroud preserved. No perfume could mask the truth. Louis XV had died not in majesty, but in putrefaction. He had been king for nearly 60 years. He left behind no legacy of triumph, only the reeking echo of what unchecked indulgence, political inertia, and scientific ignorance can do to a man, even one wearing a crown. And so, they did what anyone would do when the smell of death refuses to leave. They burned the room, the crown that inherited the stench. It did not feel like a coronation. When Louis XVI, the grandson of the rotting king, entered the gilded halls of Versailles, he did not do so as a triumphant heir. He did not wear the scent of roses or incense. He wore the stench of what came before him. Because no matter how thick the perfumes, how new the silk, or how carefully the chambermaids scrubbed the corridors, the palace still smelled of the dead. Not in the grand salons or the hall of mirrors, those were for show, but in the bedchambers, in the cracks of the floorboards, in the tapestries that refused to let go of the odor. There lingered something foul, something human, something that no crown could erase. And the new king, barely 20, nervous, hesitant, knew it. He had not been allowed to see his grandfather in his final hours. His advisors had kept him sheltered from the decay, the weeping lesions, the failed rituals, but even without seeing, he had smelled it. He had felt the fear in the air, had seen the panic in the eyes of the staff, the sudden distance of old loyalists. He had inherited more than a kingdom. He had inherited a memory of rot. The French court tried to move forward quickly. Within weeks of the funeral, the ministers declared a period of renewal. Versailles was repolished. Mirrors were cleaned. Music returned to the gardens. But beneath every violin, beneath every gentle breeze across the fountains, there lay something sour, a nation that had watched a king die in shame. And the people remembered. In Paris, the broadsheets mocked the court. Satirical cartoons showed Louis XV's bloated corpse being rolled out like garbage. Poets whispered verses about divine punishment and royal pestilence. The myth of royal perfection had been ruptured, not by revolutionaries, but by infection. Even the clergy whispered that the king's death had been a sign from God, not a peaceful passing, but a punishment for decades of moral decay, unchecked appetite, and neglect of the soul. From the pulpit to the salons, the question echoed, if a king could die like that, what does it mean for the monarchy? In the private quarters of Versailles, Louis XVI reportedly refused to use the same chamber. He ordered the tapestries replaced, the mattress burned again, the walls repainted. Some accounts suggest he even considered demolishing that entire wing, but was dissuaded by advisors who feared it would signal superstition. But the fear was real. Even Marie Antoinette, his young Austrian bride, was said to have insisted on sleeping elsewhere until the room had been completely refurnished. She brought her own incense from Vienna. It didn't help. The symbolic decay had already taken root. And outside the palace, things were worse. France was struggling. Debt from the 7 Years' War and support of the American Revolution had crippled the treasury. The poor starved, bread prices soared, and the people remembered the rumors, the dozens of mistresses, the lavish fountains, the feasts in rooms that now stank of death. The contrast between Versailles and reality had never been more apparent. In this fragile context, Louis XVI's youth, once a hope, became a liability. He was quiet, indecisive, withdrawn, compared to the forceful, virile image once projected by Louis XV. The new king seemed timid, and people whispered again, "At least the old one died rotten. This one will die afraid." That line, spoken by a Parisian fishwife, would echo through the streets just 15 years later, when revolution knocked at the gates. But for now, in 1774, Versailles pressed forward. The royal physicians, shamed by their failure to save Louis XV, pushed quietly for the introduction of inoculation. But the court remained divided. Many nobles still viewed smallpox as a divine judgment. To prevent it would be, in their view, to defy heaven. And so the seeds of further decay were sown. Meanwhile, the chamber where Louis XV had died remained sealed longer than any room in royal memory. Even when it reopened, no king would ever sleep there again. It was eventually converted into storage. The walls, once draped in brocade, were stripped bare. The servants called it La Chambre Silencieuse. No laughter, no footsteps, no light, only a memory, and a warning. Because in that room, something had ended, not just the reign of a man, but the illusion of royal immortality. Versailles, once the center of the world, had revealed its vulnerability, a place that could be soiled, saturated, defiled, not by enemies, but by its own king. And that legacy followed Louis XVI like a shadow. Every time he passed a sick servant, he flinched. Every time a courtier coughed, his eyes darted. He had seen what happens when denial rules over reason, when pride prevents protection, when science is mocked in favor of image. But it was too late. The scent of his grandfather's death still lingered, not just in the walls of Versailles, but in the soul of France itself. A nation that held its breath. France did not mourn. It inhaled, slowly, nervously, and held its breath. Because when Louis XV died, the silence that followed wasn't grief. It was hesitation, disbelief, disgust. The crowds that once lined the roads for royal funerals were thin. The bells rang, yes, but not with fervor, more with obligation. The rhythm of mourning had been broken by the memory of stench, sores, and shame. For the people of France, death was not new. They buried their own under dirt, in alleyways, in plague pits. They had seen smallpox before, but never like this, never inside the golden walls of Versailles, never rotting its highest inhabitant. What once seemed untouchable had become horribly human, and the monarchy felt it. The newspapers, still censored, found ways to speak. They published euphemisms, illness, abrupt deterioration, natural causes. But everyone knew. Letters passed between provinces described in detail what the courtiers would not. The king's flesh wept pus. The odor reached the chapel. His death was not a passing, it was a disintegration. The peasants whispered stories that grew with each telling. They said his skin peeled like wet parchment, that his tongue blackened and burst, that his coffin cracked and hissed with steam. Even if not all were true, the truth no longer mattered. What had been witnessed inside the court had already escaped into folklore. The monarchy had lost something it would never regain: mystique. Before Louis XV, kings died behind veils. Their illness was whispered, their breath monitored by clergy, their legacy polished before the coffin cooled. But now the people knew. The nobles had fled, the priests had gagged, the royal flesh had leaked, and the monarchy had no answer. The ministers tried to redirect attention. New taxes were levied, reforms were proposed. The Dauphin Louis Auguste, now Louis XVI, was presented as a clean slate. A virtuous youth, a return to moral order. He had no mistresses, no debts, no scandals, yet none of that erased the memory of his predecessor's decomposition. In truth, the fear of smallpox did more to shape the next decade of French politics than any single law. Suddenly, inoculation wasn't just a medical debate, it was a royal concern. Louis XVI, unlike his grandfather, would eventually permit the procedure, but only after long hesitation. It was the smell of Versailles, not the science, that persuaded him. For the poor, smallpox remained a sentence of death, but for the monarchy, it had become a specter of accountability. The people began to ask, if even the king can be punished with rot, what separates him from us? And the answer was increasingly, nothing. At court, etiquette changed, rooms were aired, perfumes multiplied, gloves were worn more frequently. Illness was no longer something spoken of only in private, it was feared, measured, tracked. Even gossip changed. Courtiers no longer only whispered of lovers and inheritances, they whispered about rash sightings, fevered foreheads, the dry coughs of noblemen. The palace had become paranoid. They said Louis XV's ghost haunted the halls, not as a figure in white, but as a scent, a faint, sick sweet smell that lingered after the doors were closed. It was the smell of untouched wounds, of unspoken decay. It lived in the tapestries, in the velvet, in the nightmares of those who had watched their king dissolve. And through it all, France held its breath. It waited to see if Louis XVI would rule differently, if he would wash away the sins of the grandfather, if he would restore glory. But the walls still whispered, and outside the palace gates, famine returned. In 1775, a year after Louis XV's death, the people of Paris rioted over the price of bread. Not taxes, not philosophy. Bread. They did not yet cry for revolution. They cried because their children were hungry. And they had seen with their own eyes what happens to kings who forget hunger. The phrase **le bien-aimé, the well-beloved, was no longer spoken with reverence. It was spoken with irony. Because in the end, Louis XV had not been loved. Not truly. He had been feared, entertained, consumed. His pleasures were documented, his policies less so. And when the sores came, when the pus erupted, there were no candles, no crowds, no prayers that rang beyond protocol. Only smell, only fire, only silence. And now, the new king lived among ghosts. Not just of his grandfather, but of the illusion that kings do not bleed, do not rot, do not die like the rest of us. But Louis XV had, and France had watched, and Versailles had burned. The last smell of majesty. They tried to forget. Versailles was polished. Drapes were changed. The air was perfumed with orange blossom and myrrh. Courtiers were instructed never to mention the sickness again. A new era had begun. A new king, a new queen, a new hope for France. But you remember, because no amount of incense could erase what soaked into the walls of that chamber. The sour sweet odor of dying flesh, of royal garments soaked in pus, of wood blackened not by fire, but by the slow drip of royal rot. The death of Louis XV marked more than the end of a reign. It marked the death of illusion. France had once believed its kings were appointed by God, that their blood carried divine will, that their bodies, even in death, would remain untouched by the decay that claimed commoners. But the sores on Louis XV's body did not believe in monarchy. His lesions burst like any peasant's. His groans sounded no more holy than those of the sick in Paris. His final breath was choked, wet, and alone. No angelic chorus, no divine light, only linen cloths stained brown, and priests too ill to remain beside him. In the decades that followed, the French monarchy would face crises far beyond infection, financial collapse, hunger riots, revolution, execution, but all of them, in some small way, were seated in that room, that chamber where power met pus, where sovereignty was not extinguished by a guillotine, but by gangrene. Louis XVI never spoke of it. Marie Antoinette never entered it. The room remained part of the palace tour, but only for staff. Never for guests. The servants knew. They called it La Chambre Maudite, the cursed room. One maid claimed she heard footsteps within it when it stood empty. Another swore she saw a single stain on the floorboards that could never be scrubbed out, dark, irregular, the shape of a man turned on his side. But perhaps the most haunting legacy of that death came not in the palace, but in the minds of the people. Because when the Bastille fell, when the mobs marched through Paris with torches and axes and bread knives, they did not cry out only against taxes or nobility. They cried, "Down with the rot." They remembered the sores, the dogs, the silence. They remembered a king whose body had betrayed him, whose court had abandoned him, whose legacy was buried in flame and stench. Louis XV's death was never officially portrayed in paintings. There is no royal depiction of his final moments. No masterpiece showing him surrounded by mourning nobles. No romantic portrait of deathbed serenity. Because no one could paint what his body had become. And in the absence of image, a new portrait was painted, in rumor, in pamphlet, in public memory. A man blistered with divine punishment. A king who died screaming, sweating, and alone. A sovereign so decomposed, they had to burn the room. Today, Versailles remains. Its mirrors still gleam. Its gardens bloom. Tourists pass through the gilded halls, whispering of Marie Antoinette, of opulence, of powdered wigs. But you know where to look. You know the room. You know what was once hidden behind that door. The crown that rotted, the flesh that failed, the power that leaked. And you know now what they dared not say aloud. Even majesty decays. Blank. Underscore. Blank. You are not a tourist in time. You are a witness. And what you've now remembered will never leave you again.